Hello.
Hello.
Um, Julian's our guest speaker this evening, and what I'll do is I will let Julian, well, you might prefer that I introduce you, um, or you might be very happy if you introduce yourself. I think you prefer me to introduce you, so let me find that sheet. There we go. Because you
I,
don't like blowing your own trumpet.
I, I don't mind. I've got a slide as well, but yeah, here you go. Please.
Yeah,
Your normal.
so we're absolutely delighted to welcome back Dr. Julian Owen, who founded Club B12 and still coordinates and chairs it. The last time Julian spoke to our audience was in August 2023, and what a lot has changed since then. Club B12 continues to meet fortnightly and attracts doctors and researchers from the UK, Europe, USA, and Canada, the Three Kingdoms, and many other countries. Club B12 continues to keep vitamin B12 and the issues caused by B12 deficiency at the forefront of medicine so that policy changes can be started. The journey to change is long and it's hard work. Among many valuable things Club B12 has done is set up the B12 Alliance, a working group for the chief executives of the main vitamin B12 charities. It was Club B12 that drove the rewrite to the NICE guidelines on vitamin B12 NG239, and that is currently highlighting the need for a B12D diagnosis and treatment for under 16s. I emphasize that there aren't any guidelines, not because isn't enough, because there isn't enough research, not because enough young people don't suffer. Young people do suffer. The B12 Alliance, or Club B12 through the B12 Alliance, is developing an education module for doctors, nurses, and other clinicians, which will have the endorsement of the medical establishment so that people would use it as part of their CPD.
Hugo, that's a very kind introduction, but it's always been everyone that makes these things happen, and it's not just Club 12. We're all working together, and I'll tell you about the B12 Alliance. But thank you for inviting me back. I thought Hugo sort of alluded to it. I have this interest in vitamin B12 analogs, and I'll take you through why I think analogs might be really important in understanding why we're not getting anywhere fast in the medical world at convincing hearts and minds about vitamin B12 deficiency, because I think they might be confounding the issue. Uh, so I did talk to you 2 years ago. I got a little bit of update, but I talked to you about basic B12 stuff, and so I thought we'd go for the second level. I know it's a mixed audience. The slides are quite detailed. They're all referenced, and for those of you that want to track down some of the old papers that I'll refer to, then please do because the references are there. I remain an orthopedic surgeon at Addenbrooke's Hospital, though I what's called partially retired last month, so it frees up more time to do B12. So I've probably got 2 days a week for B12 now, whereas I had none before. So hopefully we can start progressing a bit more of the science as well as the education and changing policy. One disclosure now. I was invited out to Pakistan in April. There's an importer of the Japanese methylcobalamin, Hilton Pharma, and it was a breath of fresh air, to be honest. In Pakistan, they don't have a serum B12 test because they can't afford it. The doctors look at clinical presentation and they can afford to treat with vitamin B12. So I did 5 large presentations and they thought 100 people would come to the lecture hall. Each one had about 600. We spoke to 4,000 healthcare professionals in Pakistan. Wouldn't that be fantastic if we got the same sort of impact talking about B12 in UK, Europe, and America? But they did donate money to Club 12. So Club 12 can progress what it wants to do because of the money given there. I took no money myself. That's my disclosure. Last time I teased you with a paper that was in print. It did come out in 2023, and this is kind of a summary of where we've got to in vitamin B12. We were asked by the British Medical Journal, and Bruce Wolfenbüttel was the main driver to put this together. Ralph Green, our senior author, and in the middle is myself and Mary Ward, who is a professor of nutrition at the University of Ulster. Uh, I believe this has helped some people, and it's certainly woken some primary care up to some of the issues around vitamin B12 being in the BMJ. Uh, we can refer to it and keep using it, and that's a link to it because Bruce found the money to pay the BMJ £5,000 to make it open access. Otherwise, this would sit behind a paywall, and then you wouldn't be able to get it and use it. So thanks to the university there in the Netherlands. So that's the major update. I just want to remind you how important B12 is. I know I don't have uh, to labour that too much, but I think this is important when you're trying to convince other people the relevance of B12. Is that the ancient Corin product evolved in the primeval swamp, and that folding of tetrapyrrole ring to create vitamin B12 and 15 other similar biological compounds, which we call analogues, happened back then to create the ability to methylate, to make RNA, DNA, and it's fundamental to life. It took 2 billion years to then use that as a template for chlorophyll and hemoglobin. So when we get excited in medicine about hemoglobin, we should be thinking about the archaeology of that, which started with vitamin B12. That I find helps a lot of doctors to start to focus on it a bit more. Most of them don't even know that B12 has a tetrapyrrole ring. It's just another vitamin because it's labeled as number 12. That's part of our problem to get the message across. You know this, I won't labour these, but there are 4 Nobel Prizes already in vitamin B12 science. The original Whipple, raw liver, followed by Dorothy Hodgkin, X-ray crystallography, and then 2 more modern ones around the tetrapyrrole ring, but 4 to date of Nobel Prizes. That's how important B12 is in science. B12 analogues. Hugo kind of led me into this, so I will tell you about these things. This is an old style description of how B12 works in the body. I'm hoping you can see the mouse here. But essentially, the bit I want you to look at is the nomenclature, because this B12 binds to something called R binder protein, which for the modern era is now called haptocorin. But it was also called transcobalamin 1 and 3, which is why transcobalamin, that you're aware of if you're deep into the science of how B12 works, is called transcobalamin 2, because our binder is actually the 1 and 3 of old. So it's like learning an ancient language, but it's important when you delve into the ancient papers. But what our binder is doing is 2 things. It's taking and chaperoning cobalamin further down to then be bound to intrinsic factor and absorbed. But it's also finding analogues that are not B12 and taking them out in the bile to be excreted. And that, so if they get into the body, they get excreted in the bile. And if some B12 goes with that in the excretion process, then it gets reabsorbed. But there's a system in the human for picking up things that look like B12 and aren't B12 and defending us from them. Intrinsic factor is fairly specific to B12, but not completely. So these are our mechanisms for avoiding the natural orinoids that I talked about earlier. We need to be sure we don't misunderstand what an analog is, because these we call isoforms. And this is the upper ligand of B12. You're aware of methylcobalamin, adenosylcobalamin, hydroxycobalamin, and cyanocobalamin as the forms that are available to use, and only 2 of those, of course, are the ones that are used in the human. The others are converted. But they're all available biologically. And indeed, cyanocobalamin is around naturally, and we do ingest some cyanocobalamin in our diet. What I'm talking about now is these analogues of B12. So this is your tetrapyrrole ring, and I make no apologies really, because this is the first paper I found that gave us a good picture of it, 1958, a German paper. I had it translated thanks to my colleague, who's an orthopedic surgeon at Addenbrooke's, who's a native German speaker, and I'll show you what it found. But here's a good diagram to understand. And again, there's old language here. So vitamin B12 is 5,6-dimethylbenzimidazole as the lower ligand here. So you've got your tetrapyryl ring, you've got here's cyano, because that is vitamin B12, on the top of this ring. So think of it as perhaps a Saturn, and the northern hemisphere is your hydroxy methyl adenosine. Your southern hemisphere is this other part of the molecule which binds below and changes the properties of that coronoid ring. Now, we as humans need dimethylbenzimidazole. It's rare in the biological space, and there are many other forms. Pseudo-vitamin B12 is an adenine. Factor 3, factor, because it's German, sits at the bottom, and you can see how this ring is very similar to the dimethylbenzimidazole. It just hasn't got the two methyl groups, carbon, hydrogen, CH3. It's got hydroxy. And factor A is another form, factor 3M. But I'll point you towards the pseudo, the factor 3, and the 3M, because we're going to talk about those a bit more as we go through. Pseudo B12 is very abundant in a vegan diet. It sits in spirulina, and if you think you're taking B12 when you have your algal supplements, you're not. You're mainly getting pseudo B12. And these two were used in this paper. So the three here were used to treat pernicious anemia in the Bowring paper. So the 3 and the 3M are very similar to B12. So they found that 3M is as good as B12 and the liver extract treating pernicious anemia and myelinosis in the first treatment. So these are very similar to our B12. They're biologically active, and these researchers found they actually treated pernicious anemia. They also had some conclusions that we know still are true today. The effect of the oral treatment seems to be more dependent on the resorption rather than dose. Oral therapy is inefficient for some patients. Difficult cases are better treated with intravenous. Cases with myelinosis need much higher doses, and iron replacement will have to be given in some patients to get them better. 1958. Wouldn't it be good if you could explain that to the GPs in the modern era? Not all GPs. And then the science carries on. People are aware of these analogues. We've discovered that B12 is the human form that works in all our systems, but we're starting to find that these analogues sit in human tissues. Kohlhaas, 1978. Cobalamin analogues are present in human plasma and can mask cobalamin deficiency because the current radioisotope dilution assays are not specific for true cobalamin. We have evolved our assay. Our assay is much better at weaning out the analogues. But the issue is that these analogues are in human tissues. We're just not seeing them anymore because our assay doesn't find them, but they're there. The role of B12 analogues from the same paper, the ability of man to use analogues in place of true cobalamin is much more limited than microorganisms. So our bacterial world trades in these. It's like the European Union before we changed to a euro. These different currencies that sometimes work. I used to put a franc, I think, into our school slot machine, and occasionally I'd be able to get something out of it. So they do sometimes work. It's possible that some serum cobalamin analogues possess cobalamin activity, and some act as cobalamin inhibitors, and that others are inert. So there's a melee of what these analogues can do in the human, and they're there. Such activities are inhibitory and may be different in the systems of hematologic and nervous. And Bob Allen, who was the lead in that early work and sadly passed away a couple of years ago, concluded, and this is recorded in Montreal at the 18th Congress of International Society of Hematology by another great in the B12 space who's also passed away, Victor Herbert, saying that Allen concluded that these studies suggest the possibility that cobalamin analogues of various kinds and origins may be a cause of disease in man. And I would say to you that we have not yet excluded them as a cause of disease in man. And there are some signal data that they may have a role in some of the relapsing remitting neurological diseases that still perplex us because we don't understand their cause. Victor Herbert went on to tell us more about analogues. The ileal receptor is a key lock and key receptor for complex B12 intrinsic factor. The direct B12 absorption can be blocked by analogues. So if you've got a lot of these in your bowel, you actually inhibit the absorption of your B12. So it might explain why some people need more B12 than others. The main site of absorption of analogues is in the ileum, where B12 is also absorbed. But there are two separate mechanisms. There's the intrinsic factor mechanism and then the mass action, which is how your 1 milligram of oral B12 works. Only 2 micrograms will actually be absorbed through intrinsic factor, and 1% of it, 10 micrograms, will get in through mass action. And the same could happen with these analogues. The spirulinas, I've told you this, but this is knowledge from 1988, found in food stores contain very little B12, almost exclusively analog of B12, and block B12 metabolism. There's some evidence that vegans who get very little B12 but more pseudo B12 become B12 deficient faster than someone who's just starved of B12. Something might be actually causing us to lose more B12 in that environment. And they might block human mammalian cell metabolism. And then just another study from the Allen lab just to explain how prevalent these analogues are in our bodies, because we all have a colonic biome. Cobalamin analogues are present in human feces and account for 98% of the total cobalamin plus cobalamin analogues. So in feces, only 2% is B12, and the rest is these other forms that are similar. So a major portion of a large amount of ingested cobalamin appears to be converted to those analogues. So if you swallow a milligram of B12, 2 micrograms will be absorbed in the normal way. 10 micrograms will get through mass action, and the other 988 micrograms is likely to be converted when it hits the colon into pseudo B12. So you've got this massive dose of analog in your colon by taking a massive dose of oral B12. And going further on with Victor Herbert, as pernicious anemia develops, so just feeding this into the pernicious anemia story, as pernicious anemia develops, the first loss is the gastric acids, achlorhydric stomach, and usually heavily colonized with enteric bacteria. These are the bacteria that can convert B12 into analogues. So you're getting bacteria where you shouldn't. The increased colonies of enteric bacteria in the achlorhydric stomach and small intestine of pernicious anemia may produce analogues, which may accelerate the development of B12 deficiency. Block the uptake with intrinsic factor. May be absorbed by diffusion or otherwise. So these analogues are being produced, they might be getting into your bloodstream as well. So this may be part of pernicious anemia, why some people have totally different profiles to others. Something to do with bacterial overgrowth and the conversion to analogues. And Ralph Carmel, who did some very good work and published in in one of the major American journals about how the modern serum B12 test, competitive bioluminescent assay, wasn't as good as it should be. The New England Journal of Medicine he published about 20 years ago. But he also found this, that neurological abnormalities of cobalamin deficiency are associated with higher cobalamin analog values than are hematological abnormalities. So in his patient group, those who had neurological problems, not just anemia, had more analogues in their blood with an inverse relationship. We've not investigated these findings. We've not understood them any further. And the reason we haven't is it's really hard to measure analogues. But we have now got a platform in Norwich where we can start to measure analogues and B12 at serum quantities, billionths of a gram. So we can start to look at human tissues and start to see what's there and what's not. So this is just the start of a new renaissance of, I think, of B12 research. And then that's analogues, just to get you thinking about that and whether that's relevant to some of the things we don't understand. I think it is, and I think we've a duty to at least exclude it as a confounding factor in a lot of the B12 problems that we see. I'm just going to run through some of the understanding of how B12 might play a relationship in some of the diseases that we're regularly treating in our clinics. Diabetes, frailty, fractures, dementia, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, and Crohn's disease all have a relationship with vitamin B12. Diabetes to start with. So I might say as we go along how many of these people are members of Club 12, but just assume that most of these people who write in the B12 space, I've managed to encourage to join our community, Club 12, to share the research and build and move faster. Rima Obeid is a member of Club 12, and she published this serum B12s not reflecting vitamin B12 status in patients with type 2 diabetes. So our problem is, and diabetic neuropathy may have a B12 role here. Certainly in Pakistan, they tell me they're about to publish with a treatment protocol that resolves peripheral neuropathy in the diabetic patients. It involves a lot of high dose B12, but what I'm awaiting for that paper, it should be out soon. But certainly in Pakistan, this is what they're doing for diabetic neuropathy, high dose B12 and prolonged. But part of the problem here is that the B12 in your serum B12 doesn't reflect the B12 status of your cells in diabetes. The conclusions here are that red blood cell B12 was lower in diabetes compared with controls. Concentrations of vitamin B12 and hollow TC, which is the carrier protein in the blood, so that's transcobalamin 2 in old literature, not haptocorrin. And it didn't differ significantly between the groups, but plasma methylmalonic acid, which is another measure of B12 status, and it measures how much B12 is getting into your cells, plasma MMA concentrations were significantly higher in diabetics. So the message here is diabetics, when you suspect B12 deficiency, your serum B12 is not going to be good enough. So we are missing a good number of diabetics that need B12 because we're doing a serum B12 and relying on it. Now, this is now known, and I'll show you, and it's known and disseminated to primary care and the diabetic clinics. Patients with type 2 diabetes showed normal extracellular vitamin B12, but disturbed intracellular B12-dependent biochemical reactions, which is what I just said. Metformin, which is a common treatment for diabetes, was associated with a low serum B12, but improved intracellular B12 metabolism. So that may be part of the role of metformin is just that it improves B12 cellular metabolism. So our Medical Devices Regulatory Agency, MHRA, has come out and said metformin reduces B12 levels and we need new monitoring. Now, Rima's paper suggests it's a bit more complicated with metformin, but the message is good that's gone out to the medical community, because it says that decreased B12 levels or vitamin B12 deficiency is now considered to be a common side effect in patients with metformin, and a vast majority of patients are on metformin as a first-line treatment. We're therefore advising to check B12 serum levels in patients treated with metformin and symptoms of vitamin B12 deficiency. And the problem here is that serum B12 isn't necessarily good enough, and that's where NICE guidance comes in and says use an MMA. Actually, these researchers in China found that a urinary MMA was very predictive of diabetic peripheral neuropathy. And if you looked at an HbA1c, this is the predictive value of diabetic neuropathy, is very highly predictive with a p-value of 0.001, which is highly predictive if you know statistics. But the urinary MMA, so maybe there's a role for urinary MMA in general practice in the diabetic patients. I will move faster because I want to have time for questions, but these slides will make available. The conclusion in diabetes is, B12 is not getting into the cells so effectively. More of the injected B12 is lost in the urine. Raising serum B12 is just the start. Getting the MMA down is the goal. So we've got a cohort of patients, and it's growing, where B12 is relevant to that outcome in diabetes. I'll put this in because it's close to my heart as an orthopedic surgeon, and it explains some of the things that I perhaps should be more aware of. But a very old paper which used a different form of B12, serum B12 study, which was actually the older B12 tests are actually often better for B12 status. But it did show that frailty was B12 deficiency led to frailty, or they were associated. A lot of the work I do or have done, I don't do so much trauma anymore, is looking after elderly patients who fall over and break their hip. And anything we can do to stop people breaking their hips, which accounts for about 10% of the healthcare spend, is important. So looking at the nutritional status and the B12 status of those patients is important. And we're doing that more on the wards now than we ever have. Our ortho geriatricians are aware of this now and are more aggressive at managing B12 deficiency in our elderly patient group. And then this links in with old papers, back again, what year are we in? 1992, which found that people with pernicious anemia were more likely to have a fractured neck of femur. And that didn't relate to their neurological problems, it was purely down to their B12 deficiency. Twice as many hip fractures. And if you look at the bone density, can an intervention help? Well, this is Mary Ward's team with other colleagues at the University of Ulster. And they have a cohort, they're looking at B vitamin supplements, and these are very low dose B vitamin supplements. But if you take the group with a low B12 on a microbiological assay, which is better, and you supplement them, their bone mineral density doesn't drop as fast. Now, our osteoporosis clinics and our metabolic bone clinics are not yet locked in to the fact that B vitamins are important in that as well. It's all D and other things and steroids. So I need to change that. I've got a lot of work educating my colleagues. Dementia. Bjorn Regland, who has now retired, a psychiatrist who saw links with 1-carbon and schizophrenia, lots of things. But he did find this in his junior PhD thesis and over 30 years never managed to get traction. That the ratio of analogues and active B12 concentration in the serum correlated significantly with serum homocysteine, serum MMA, and CSF B12. And treating intramuscular injections with hydroxycobalamin, therefore 2 months of the initial injection, after treatment, serum homocysteine levels fell significantly in his demented patients. He also found that the B12 concentration in the CSF gave a rough estimate of the utilization. I think I'm going to move a bit faster here because I can see this is taking a bit too long. But these papers will be available to you. This is important. So this is Regland, and have moved on a few years. I don't know if you've met Andrew McCadden. His name was mentioned by Hugo earlier on, working on some patient stories of looking for high serum B12 patients that respond to B12 injections. But Alzheimer's patients had significantly lower active coronoid than control subjects. The analog coronoid ratio was significantly higher in the Alzheimer's group. So what's going on there? Why do you have more analogues to B12 in the Alzheimer's group? But also, genetically, if your transcobalamin is one genetic form compared to another, it changes your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Now, transcobalamin is a carrier protein to the cells of B12. So what is it about that that makes you more likely to get Alzheimer's with one polymorphism than another? So our proteins in our body, different people have slightly altered proteins that still work, but they sometimes work slightly differently. And those polymorphisms predict your risk for the carrier protein. But he also found that the receptor, so it's called the CD320, is the cellular receptor for B12. And he found also that that predicted your risk of Alzheimer's. So this message is out there. It's going to be a subset of Alzheimer's where B vitamins are highly relevant to the disease. And it's about working out which subset that we need to treat and identify the deficiency and help improve it as a comorbidity in the disease. And David Smith, who's fully retired, was an active member of Club 12 for a good many of the first few years. In fact, he helped me have the idea to set it up. He was one of the first people that helped me on the B12 space. But he and Helga Refsum have written extensively on the role of B12, raising homocysteine, low B12, and the cognitive impairment seen in dementia. Now, Very recently, this has come out of the Californian group, again, people within the Club 12 group. But what they're finding is that the R binder, the haptocorin, when that's high carrying, then it predicts your risk of other markers of Alzheimer's disease. So a higher carrier protein will predict your risk of Alzheimer's. So low, I'll read it out, it'd be easier. At low levels of B12, specifically when bound to transcobalamin for cellular uptake, evidence of slower conductivity in the brain could point towards impaired myelin. High levels of B12, specifically when bound to the biologically inert transport protein haptocorin, biomarkers of neurodegeneration appear in the serum, indicating neuroaxonal injury. So why is the R binder haptocorin level going up in these diseases? We don't understand this in any great detail, but we need to be looking. So this is really important data that's been published in this year. Parkinson's, B12 and homocysteine levels. This is a researcher that's sponsored by the Michael J. Fox Foundation. We've had a conversation as B12 Alliance, and they're thinking about joining us. We'll tell you about the B12 Alliance. But Michael J. Fox Foundation has spent $4 billion on Parkinson's research over the years. But Chad Christine is writing these papers in the B12 space. So for that charity realizes the importance of looking at B12 in Parkinson's. Vitamin B12 and homocysteine levels predict different outcomes in early Parkinson's disease. Relationships of cerebrospinal marker fluid of B12 status markers with Parkinson's disease to do with progression and long-term intake of folate B12, B6 and B12 in the instance of Parkinson's. So watch this space, but there are links between B12 and Parkinson's outcome and Parkinson's progression. These are some of the conclusions. Early Parkinson's disease, low B12 status was common. Low B12 at baseline predicted greater worsening of the mobility, whereas elevated homocysteine predicted greater cognitive decline. In these untreated early Parkinson's patients, low CSF B12 predicted greater worsening of a predictive score, walking item, where the CSF total homocysteine was not associated. Our results provide moderate support for a possible protective effect of B12 on the development of Parkinson's. More work to do there. Multiple sclerosis. This is Ted Reynolds, who's a member of Club 12, and right at the end is a colleague of mine who left B12 research because he said, I couldn't measure these analogs, I couldn't measure anything, I moved into a career, and he's my rehab. So he's my rehab physician. If one of our trauma patients loses their leg, he looks after them. But this is a paper he wrote back in 1992 as a junior doctor. Patients with MS had significantly lower serum B12 levels and significantly higher unsaturated R binder capacities. So haptocorin again, than neurologically normal. There's a significant association between MS and disturbed B12 metabolism. Vitamin B12 deficiency should always be looked for in patients with MS. The cause of the B12 disorder and the nature of the overlap with MS deserves further investigation. Well, that investigation is really slow to move on because that is 33 years ago. Here's one small snippet of what might happen if we start looking at MS and B12. If you give B12 and folic acid supplements to patients with MS, then this is a placebo study to determine the effect, but vitamin group received 5 milligrams of folic acid tablet daily and 3 doses of B12 at 100 micrograms. A significant improvement in the mental field of life quality in the placebo group was seen. So my neurology colleagues will say, B12, it's all placebo, we don't bother with it anymore. But this study shows that the patients who had real B12 had a neurological improvement. So those neurologists are correct. There is a placebo effect to having B12, but it only helps you with your mental field. If you want neurological improvement in multiple sclerosis, you need the real B12. So these links need exploring. Actually, historically, 1960, there was a depot, a slow release version of B12. Now, this I don't think we can reimagine. We can reimagine, but we can't use the old version because it had sesame seed oil and other things that perhaps we can't use in an allergenic world. But this B12 was injected and slowly released into the tissues. And in patients with multiple sclerosis, they found that they absorbed the injection of normal B12, less of it was absorbed, so it's not getting in the cells. More of it was found in the urine, but if you used a slow release, that improved the uptake into the cells of B12. So there's something about cellular absorption of B12 in multiple sclerosis, just as there is in diabetes. And here's perhaps a part of what's explained there. The receptor expression in human brains was lower in the MS plaques than in normal human brains. So there's less receptor. So that would mean less uptake of B12. So needing higher concentrations of B12 to treat in multiple sclerosis. So if we give the normal dose and don't see a good effect, perhaps we're not doing the right thing. We can't just say it doesn't work. Perhaps we have to look at a different treatment strategy if it's not getting in. Just a quick Crohn's disease, there is some evidence from Jean-Louis Gayon's work, who is an active researcher in B12 and part of Club 12, where they found the Crohn's bowel had changes that could be that the analogues are actually causing the Crohn's disease. For research at some point, it's not just about Crohn's damaging your terminal ileum and your absorption ability. So that covers the links with other diseases, which I think might be really important when we're trying to educate people to understand that this isn't as simple, and you can't just stand on some of the old dogma. And this is what we're doing about it. So Club 12 we formed in 2020 to facilitate the sharing and knowledge of and coordinate research into vitamin B12 between scientists and healthcare professionals. And a number of those papers I've shown you, they came to Club 12 and they presented at Club 12 when we start to have that dialogue and help people who are outside the B12 space but discover through their research that B12 is relevant to their research. Then we can bring them in and start to share the knowledge and look at new projects. We're set up to stimulate discussion of the uncertainties surrounding B12 deficiency, promote and encourage research into all aspects of B12, encourage multidisciplinary conversations around B12, and disseminate research findings to clinicians and the wider public. So everything that we're trying to achieve there, big ask. We have members of the group, and we do have enlightened neurologists, hematologists, psychiatrists, gastroenterologists, endocrinologists, obs and gynae, trauma and orthopedics. There's one of those. And then primary care, psychologists, clinical chemists, biochemists, genetics, B12 Alliance members, we'll come to that, and some lay members. But we're not taking on more lay members. The representation is coming through the B12 Alliance. So it dawned on me going through this, talking to people like Hugo and the other leaders of these groups, that it would be better if we all worked together. And we managed to create a group now, which is under the auspices of Club 12, but we meet separately. And I think you had a talk from Katrina Burchell, who chairs the Chief Executive Officer of the Pernicious Anaemia Society recently. But the Pernicious Anaemia Society, the B12 Society, hyperhomocystinuria America, these are the genetic abnormalities in B12 processing. And the children there, if they're not given IM-B12 at birth, they will die of B12 deficiency. And our representative there, Brittany Park, she lost her first child. The genetics showed that there was a cobalamin processing disorder. And the second child got the injections and is alive, and she's representing the hyperhomocystinuria. So that genetic group is really interesting in understanding what happens in the general B12 deficiency, because they're nature's experiments, sadly. But there's a lot to learn if we look at what's happening there. The B12 Institute, you were talking about the Rotterdam earlier on, and of course your good selves, and a Norwegian group, B12 Foreningen. And we're looking at the next layer of the onion skin. There is interest in some of the Parkinson's and Alzheimer's groups to be involved in what we're doing. So I've been working with Getting It Right First Time. Tim Briggs, who set up the program, is an orthopedic surgeon. He gets it, but it's not easy to find funding or prioritize what we're doing around the B12 space. But he is aware that we need methylmalonic acid in our labs around the country. There are only 3 labs in the country that currently can do an MMA. That's got to change if NICE is saying do an MMA if you're not sure. No one can get it. As a general practitioner, you can't order this thing. So GIRF needs to help us with that. It's called Getting It Right First Time, and it's part of clinical improvement in the NHS. But what I'd also like GERF to do is to create a pathway. And we've got some draft pathways that we've been building in the Alliance of how to manage B12 deficiency. Because I think you're all aware that different CCGs have different pathways and they're not always good on how to manage B12 deficiency. Education program, I think you've told that we're trying to put together, so there's one education program, and that is interested in one of the NHS packages of putting an online training program based on the B12 Alliance education program, which has used the great depth and knowledge amongst our experts to refine that education packet and make sure that it's accurate and correct. We're moving towards doing something in the House of Commons early next year, and there are a good number of members of the Alliance that are willing to help fund that, because it's quite expensive to get a room and get the MPs along, but we want to do that at the beginning of next year. And MHRA, there are conversations. We've lobbied once before with David Smith before he fully retired to try and look at the way we administer B12, make it available. Sub-Q injections would be good. Not everyone needs IM, but it's not currently in the BNF. So that's the sort of lobbying there that we're doing. And so there's time for questions. This statement from William Beck, a hematologist, 1998, I think holds true, and I'll show you one more paper that's just come out which is relevant to this B12 space that needs more investigation. It's not solved. Not teaching medical students nutrition for 10 years and none of them knowing what B12 looks like molecularly is tragic for me. That's part of the problem. To the stalwart little band of investigators of vitamin B12, now more rationally termed cobalamin, there is comfort in knowing that the stream of important scientific problems will never end. If the past is any guide to the future, there will be difficult problems inciting tumult and controversy, and in the end, they will yield broad biologic insights and many surprises. Now, 1998, how many years? 27 years on, we have still got a lot more of that to go. That renaissance in research that I hope we get, I hopefully will start to reveal those things. So this is a paper from the same Californian unit, which is starting to disseminate into the neurological world, because they took, in their neurological unit, they had patients they couldn't explain the neurology. And they took them and they ran them through massive processing to see if there were any proteins or anything that explained and had any correlation with that group that brought them together. And what they discovered is that they had anti-B12 receptor antibodies. So this is a new autoimmune disease that starts to explain why a high serum B12 in some patients can't get in the cell, because you've got antibodies destroying the receptor. Now, this is prevalent in normal humans, a small number of these antibodies, but in these patients, it was highly elevated. And when they treated them with high dose B12, they got better. So this is a paper to take to a neurologist who's not listening, because this is real and they've got to wake up to this. And then the neurologists are only saying what they've been taught. They are amenable to change. It just takes a little while. So we are having some traction with neurologists now. So don't blame them. It's the way they're educated. It's the neurological belief that B12 is a placebo. It's the poor blood test which doesn't reveal B12 deficiency that they did for many years when the new blood test came in and they found no deficiency, so they stopped doing it. It's all those things. So thank you for listening. That's me, and that's Club 12. Thanks, Hugo.
Thank you very much. We've already got a thank you for this very interesting lecture from someone whose question I will read out later anyway. One thing that has been mentioned earlier on is to what extent is the diet causing B12, the modern Western diet causing B12 deficiency? Are there particular products in the modern Western diet, apart from causing inflammation in the gut, that might be causing B12 deficiency as well?
I think what we'll find is that the microbiome is the new area of research. We know it's linked to many diseases, and I think one of the mediators will be the B12 analog space. So things that alter your biome and take you away from what a Mediterranean diet should do, and there are many things that do that, along with the fact that we are moving more plant-based. and rightly so, to save the planet. But we can't go completely unless we take supplements and monitor our B12 status with MMA and homocysteine. And if we don't do that, then we will have more people with deficiency. But this, what's known as the standard American diet, is not that replete in B12 either. So we need to go back to basic diet of fresh seafood and white meats, chicken, and a good fresh fruit and veg diet, and nuts and pulses. And the ultra processed is not good. So I think that will all link into this story, but yet to be fully defined.
And it's probably linked to a whole lot of other symptoms anyway, where B12 is just one of many things going wrong all at the same time.
That's right. And Martin Warren, who I co-founded B12, and Wilhelmina Retzma, who's a GP, the three of us put Club 12 together 6 years ago nearly. And he is doing some work with children with obesity, and the micronutrient status of many of the micronutrients is really poor in those children. But one of the other tragedies is we don't have good blood tests for any of those micronutrients. So we need to start investing in nutritional research. When I was an undergraduate at Cambridge, we had an MRC funded Done Nutrition unit. When I came back to Cambridge as a consultant, it had gone. The funding had been moved over to the mitochondrial research unit. Very worthy cause. But we should not have stopped researching nutrition, and we need to get MRC funding for nutrition once again.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So Mike, who I was talking to at the beginning, said, "Are there no pediatricians in Club B12?" I think you've just answered that, but perhaps you'd like to answer more fully.
No, there are. There are, but it's that there are some issues in a community to putting your head above the parapet and calling things. We need the science that people can have the confidence to present good new papers to their colleagues to change hearts and minds. And sadly, when you really look at the science around B12, it hasn't progressed for many years. NICE couldn't find much good data. There are many unanswered questions in that NICE program. The reason perhaps we're upset with what NICE are guiding and we'd like it to be more aggressive is because the science is not there to do so. And medicine has to be dominated by science. So that they are there and they are interested and they are sharing samples, and we're looking at haptocorrin levels in allergy as well, which seems to be higher, and trying to work out why. So yes, we do have pediatricians.
Yes, absolutely. And that's what you just said as I asked you the question. Just before you asked the question, you'd already just said there were pediatricians. My grandmother has recently been diagnosed with dementia. I'm B12 deficiency. My mum is iron deficient. I wonder whether or not my grandma is anemic in the same way, or if it's a genetic thing.
I think we'll uncover that whole combination of genetics, epigenetics, and nutritional status in the development of those things. But it's very hard to unpick. And what's absolutely not known is whether you're locking the stable door after the horse has bolted, if B12 has a role in dementia. At what point will intervention help, and at what point is it too late if it does? If you go way back to the understanding that B12 helped people with subacute combined degeneration of the cord. There were people that got B12 and didn't get better. The neurology was already too far gone. So we don't know, sadly. That prevention with all the things with good nutrition and not getting to that state. But yes, we are dealt cards, and we are dealt cards in the womb. So your risk of diabetes is in some way predictable by your mother's B12 status as you're growing in the womb. And one of our members in Pune province in India has shown that a low dose supplement in the mainly vegetarian population there will reduce. So he's been doing it for 30 years with his wife going out to the villages. And he's a diabetologist. He's shown that the risk of diabetes as you become adult is lower if your mother was taking 2 micrograms of B12 a day. So but once those genetic epigenetics is defined, you can't go back. So I didn't know what epigenetics was because I studied in medicine before we really talked about it. But my best example is because I keep bees. The female larvae that's laid in a bee colony has the same DNA, and what the bees feed that larvae define whether it's twice the size and is a queen bee or it's just a worker bee. And 502 genes are methylated, and they then create a queen. That's what epigenetics is. So it's not the genes you're dealt with, but it's the way your genes are managed in the early phase. That's epigenetics. That's going to have a big play in all this as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I think we found papers that said the children of people from the Netherlands starved during the Nazi occupation in the 40s were more likely to be B12 deficient for 2 generations as their genes gradually recovered from the starvation during their pregnancy and early childhood.
And a mother will give a third of its B12 to a child. So if you
Yes.
start having if you have a series of children, you're not replenishing in between, that's a problem for the mother. We just need to make sure we replenish and eat well. Yeah.
So I don't know what the question is, so I'll have to hope you do, otherwise we'll have to go back to the person. Would RAI for thyroid lead to B12 deficiency?
So not a radioimmunoassay. Is this? I'm not sure what that question is.
Okay, no worries. I will ask.
Thyroid, the only thing you'd say is when the body's stressed, it uses more B12. That seems to be the case. People report that, and any kind of chemotherapy, radiotherapy is going to stress the body and perhaps increase your demand. I don't know if that answers the question.
I've asked what RAI stands for. We'll see exactly what it is. Sleep apnea. What are the links to sleep apnea?
I don't have any direct links for you there. Other than sleep apnea has a relationship with obesity, and we know that if you the diet that people eat when they're obese or become obese is more likely to be B12 deficient. But but I can't give you a link.
Yes, I've heard that there's a certain amount of correlation, but it doesn't always imply um, causation. Sue asked, does your group have a donation route to raise funds? I presume she's talking about Club B12.
There is a web link. I never quite know how to do that, but we haven't gone actively out for funds for a while. I think we may all want to raise some funds for the House of Parliament thing, where it is that there is a cost. That's the next thing we might want to do as a group in the B12 Alliance. So there is a donations page on the Club 12
On the
website.
Club 12. Yeah.
And we're a not-for-profit. We're looking at becoming a charity, but that carries a whole load of complexity. And at the moment, it works very well. We have a committee, we have accounts every year, so it's managed. And the committee have agreed we will put some of our money towards the parliamentary program. So anything that replenishes the funds is good. But I can see in the future we go for direct campaigns for particular causes.
Yes.
And then that would feel easier. Yeah.
Certainly for the parliamentary one, we're setting up a page for the B12 Alliance to raise funds for the parliamentary event, and that will be across all the charities involved, all the UK charities at least, because it's the UK Parliament, rather than each individual charity raising money separately and giving it in. Seems a better way to work. If a patient is on metformin in order to become pregnant, should they be on B12 by injection, and how much?
Uh, okay, so I'm not a gynecologist. There are links between metformin and B12 deficiency, but the MHRA guidance is just to monitor the B12 status, not to give everyone blanket B12 treatment. So no, the answer isn't not. It's to eat well and make sure you're eating all the right things. One of my bugbears is the use of supplements to make up for something you're not getting in your diet. I mean, treatment is one thing, and that's injections for me for B12. When you're deficient, you need injections to get you back up, and then tablets to maintain. So the idea that you need a supplement is perhaps because you haven't balanced your diet as well as you might, unless you have a particular absorption problem like pernicious anemia.
Yes, absolutely. So you still need a balanced diet, regardless. Um, RAI for possibly having a cause seems to be radioactive iodine. Um, so the question, where's the question got to? Would receiving radioactive iodine for thyroid lead to B12 deficiency?
I haven't seen that. I can't directly link it other than what I've said, that any stressors seem to increase your demand for B12.
Yeah. Um, Ree says, do you think there is any risk of muscle damage due to the long-term, every other day intramuscular injections from any microtrauma to the muscles as opposed to the B12? Reason for asking is I don't find subcutaneous effective, but don't want to risk damage to muscles if recovery takes months or years. Now, I'll speak for myself before you start answering that. Yesterday, I ran the Great North Run. 60,000 of us ran it. And I have been injecting into my leg for many years, every other day. So I don't believe micro damage is that damaging to muscle, but you'd know as a
I,
doctor.
I don't think so either. But there are some programs just starting, and Club 12 is negotiating with a pharmaceutical company to perhaps get a higher concentration, lower volume injection, and also to take it through MHRA for sub-Q. So those things would be really helpful to the people that need B12. And so perhaps reducing the volume would be a good thing to do, just so it's less painful. But in terms of actual long-term damage, I think not.
Yeah.
But people do vary their sites, don't they, as well?
Yes, I use mostly the same site. Obviously, I can't be that accurate, but within a centimeter. And I've probably done 300 or 400 injections over the years. Um, but I'm putting zero point 0.1 of a milliliter in terms of volume because I'm using a reasonably concentrated start point. Um, so any optometrists in Club B12?
That there is, yes, but they're not practicing, but they
Yeah,
have trained as an optometrist. So yes,
yeah.
we
So
do.
we do have that involvement. We observed that nystagmus, the twitching of the eye, could sometimes occur in people with B12 deficiency, but that's one of the many neurological symptoms in our opinion.
So I didn't show you the whole paper, but Ari Green in the University of California is looking at optic nerve conduction studies and various things around the eye. So he's heavily involved in the eye uh, area, and that it's quite a good predictor of B12 deficiency and progression. Um, Keep optic nerve conduction.
Yes, absolutely. Here's someone asking, um, is there someone has PA, might they need digestive enzymes or betaine hydrochloride?
That's really getting into the thick of it. Um, I think if you've got PA and you're not absorbing it, then you're moving most likely to need injections. There is something called a Cobazorb test, and in Denmark they managed to move people off injections because they measured their haptocorrin levels come up on oral because we haven't got a Schilling test anymore because we're not
Yes.
going to use radioisotopes anymore. So I think those I don't have an answer for those. Maybe they're studies, but they're not the primary. There is a treatment for pernicious anemia that works. Um, uh, the more we use omeprazole, the less acid we have, the less iron and B12 we absorb. So these things aren't helping that pernicious anemia either. But it's more the non-pernicious anemics and their iron deficiency where those things might help.
Julian, you mentioned placebo effect. How long is this placebo effect manifest or understood by the medical establishment? Month, years, or forever? I ask because placebo is the reason my GP neurologists do not want to acknowledge my symptoms. I think you said the placebo effect was what people said, not what was actually the case. But
That paper was the first sort of inkling that something ammunition to take to the neurologist. Say, look, you get neurological improvement with B12, you get no neurological improvement with a placebo. Uh, so the placebo effect, I don't know. I can share the paper and you can see if that
Yeah.
data is in there. But it's a real problem because I took some of this B12, serum B12, can we have an MMA, to my medical director at Addenbrooke's, and the neurologists, who he then asked what did they think of what Mr. Owen was saying as an orthopedic surgeon, because that was his duty as a medical director to speak to the neurologists and hematologists, and they did poo-poo what I was saying, said, look, it's just placebo, don't worry about it, medical director. So so I got nowhere. So I realized I
Yeah.
had to take a different tack. Um,
And
it
we
is
had the same
widely
problem.
held in that echo chamber of neurology that this B12 is not that important. And I've
Yeah.
had it said in meetings to me at the grand round, do you know how much B12 is in the body? It can't be that important, by a professor of neurology in a grand round. We'll work on it.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Do you know how much B12 there is in the body?
3 milligrams.
Yep. So when you inject, it's actually quite a huge amount compared to the total amount that was in the body to begin with.
If you're lucky, you'll get 100 micrograms into your cells. But if you've got diabetes or multiple sclerosis, you'll pee more of it out.
Yes. So, how closely do iron levels need monitoring on someone with on B12 injections?
Yeah, this science isn't fully established. Andrew Klein is actually an iron expert before he's become a B12 expert, and it was only my persuading him that B12 was important in his clinical group that he discovered it was, and they got doubly better if he managed both. He believes that as either deficiency is replenished, you do need to cover the other one in most people to get the best results. But we don't have science to back that up. But
Yeah,
but but measuring your transferrin saturations is deemed to be one of the best ways of managing iron status. But I'm not an iron expert, but that's what Andrew would say.
I've certainly taken the view it's not so much that one causes the deficiency of the other, rather that if you resolve a deficiency in one, then you might see the deficiency in the other that was always there but was hidden by the deficiency of the worst deficiency, what I call my leaky buckets
Absolutely.
theory. Or,
That
yeah,
limiting step, you deal with one and you find something else, don't
yeah, probably try and deal with all of them. Rosemary's asked, do you have anything specific on epileptic seizures and B12, please? Which also brings me around to another of my pet hobbies, which is a potential link between B12 and migraines.
So there is a little bit of neurological understanding, and we had a brief conversation with the pediatric neurologists at Great Ormond Street, and they felt by optimizing B12 status helped their difficult epileptic patients. So that there is something in that, but then folate has a relevance as well. So again, another area of science that has needs elucidation. But the signal data in many of these areas that B12 has a role.
Yes. And because it is so fundamental, as one of your early slides showed, so far back in the development of animals and plants, um, it's
It
bound to
knitted into.
interact with other things.
I was at a wedding on Saturday, and I spoke to someone, and someone else came up to me and said, "B12, you're interested in B12? I've just written a paper that shows tuberculosis has a mechanism for finding hosts with good B12 status so they can infect them rather than low B12 patients. And there is something which is called a ribo switch in which is B12 dependent. So the B12 locks into the DNA RNA of tuberculosis and says, don't bother with this host. Wait for another one. It switches it on or off. It's knitted
You,
into life.
it's that's a fascinating thought. You'd thought that TB would just say, let's go for everybody, because it's not exactly a finite number of
Yeah.
bacteria, is it? They just multiply up. But
Yeah. Well, there you go.
there we go. Yes. So the first thing to do if you think you're catching tuberculosis is to drink plenty of alcohol, because it will reduce your B12 and the TB might pass you by.
So certainly, our tuberculosis clinic is very interested in B12 status. It's looking for those things.
Yes. B12 injections caused my hypothyroidism. Um, my GP still thinks I'm hypothyroid in spite of not having any thyroid medicines for approximately 16 years. So talk a little bit about the connection between B12 and the endocrine system.
No, well, there's things we don't know. There's things we do. We do know there's a crossover between autoimmune diseases, and pernicious anemia, being an autoimmune disease, has a 30-something% crossover with with hypothyroidism. But in terms of any deeper medical understanding, I'm not sure we've got that.
Yeah. So Dr. Chandy and I were decided, but without being able to do all the microscopy required, that because B12 affects cell membranes, most obviously in the myelin sheath around nerve cells, but affects cell membranes in general, that it could well be it would therefore have an impact on the whole endocrine system. But just as a generic concept, we thought most likely through the pituitary, because if the pituitary doesn't know how much of a hormone there is floating around, then it can't adjust the levels to the right amount. But that was much more, that was theoretical rather than based on any
So bring
research.
on my renaissance of B12 research, or I should say B12 and analog research.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so someone, oh, Mary says, it's not good to take spirulina. It makes me feel and look better. I've been taking it since the 70s. I have heard that some of the spirulinas do produce something that works as well or almost as well as B12 itself.
So I'm not sure what that's saying. So there are many micronutrients in those algal supplements that are good, but the pseudo B12 is not good. There are other algal supplements, chlorella, and chlorella is a bit of Russian roulette, but some of them are full of B12 and some are full of pseudo B12. So you don't know what you're getting, but it might work. So it's but the spirulina itself, and we'd have another member of Club 12, Professor Alison Smith, who's the professor of plant biology here at the University of Cambridge, and she's been doing work around that, and she does present at Club 12 every now and then. And we've got some more of that being presented at the Club 12 meeting in 2 weeks' time. So
Certainly, what you showed suggested that it wasn't only one form of. I always thought the cobalamins were anything with the amine rings and the cobalt in the middle. I might be wrong on that, and therefore there's a whole lot more cobalamins than there are B12s
there
and
are
B12 analogs. But
growing, there are 15 corinoids that have a lower ligand. There are other forms of B12 molecule which have been chopped off and are in the body, but they have no biological function. But the ones that are dangerous are the full molecule that works in bacterial enzyme systems. And they trade in them and they work for various things. Those are the ones that I'm worried that we have not looked at properly.
yes, yes. Here's a confirmation from Jill. My B12 injections cured my awful daily migraines, and I think someone said a little bit before about the same thing, saying, um, yes, Emma says massively reduced the amount of migraines I get. I only get the odd occasional one now. So,
We've heard
um,
that, Hugo. I think that's fantastic. I think the way to bring medicine on board is not to say that diseases are caused by B12 deficiency, just that they're what's known as a comorbidity. And in
yes,
many chronic diseases, it's good to manage the comorbidities, and then the end disease is much better, uh, is less symptomatic, less of a problem. So that's my angle, is to go to the neurologist and say, can we manage B12 deficiency as a comorbidity in these diseases? That's what we're seeing in the Parkinson's work, in the Alzheimer's work, that it's there, and it's there in MS, but little people are not looking at it so much.
and I think that's very good advice because what you don't want to do is go to the specialist and say, I read something on the internet. You want to say, let's talk about this gently in a way that respects the many, many years of knowledge that the specialist has built up. Um, Whether we think that it's a cause or not, we wouldn't say so.
Well, that's where my view that I we will find perhaps that some people have a high analog load that is causing some form of disease that looks like that might be a subset of these diseases yet to be shown.
Yes. Um, Sheila asks, what are the risks with the high folic acid dose and B12? She currently takes 5 milligrams later. daily, but it has been mentioned it may be too much even on every other day injections.
Yeah, so there does seem to be a problem if you overdo the folic acid, and there are some studies coming through that the high folate, low B12 status is the worst neurologically. Not only do you mask B12 deficiency, and that's what was found historically in pernicious anemia, that the folate was given to people with pernicious anemia and they got better for a while, and then they completely went off a cliff. But there are some cellular studies, some rodent studies, and that again, one of the Californian units is showing in rodents that the mothers with a low B12 high folate diet produce autistic pups. So this is an area that needs a lot of research to see whether the growth in autism is not just about us diagnosing more that was already there. There's probably something in the diet, and it may be that countries that folate fortify have more trouble. And we've certainly got people within Club 12 that believe that fortification is causing its own problems in those countries. And Canada fortifies more than the US. And so our Canadian member is very worried about what that's doing. So we don't. So I think that the science is starting to suggest you can overfolate.
Yes, yes. I think it's further complicated that people are so different from each other that some people need high methylation, so they take the methylfolate instead of folic acid. Some people can't get on with methylfolate and need to take folic acid. Um,
There
it,
are two
yeah,
receptors for folate on the body, and,
yeah,
and one of them, which has an autoantibody in some of the autism patients, um, won't work with the basic. It blocks the basic folate uptake completely, and you
yeah,
need the more active folate to use the other receptor. So
yes,
there's some science evolving in the folate space, which is more invested in research to start to unpick these findings.
yes. But it's never simple, unfortunately. Um, Jay asks, Russell Jones implicates riboflavin B2 deficiency with B12 deficiency and many other conditions, including CFS. Um, I'm presuming that's one of those. There are lots of things that are involved in any set of symptoms.
It,
Answers, is it?
it is, but it's believed that the folate, the riboflavin deficiency isn't as common as the other deficiencies. But there are certain gene pools where it's really important, and a third of the Irish gene pool is very sensitive to that, and it's starting to explain some of the hypertension of pregnancy and predict hypertension in later years. So these are important. We're back to having a micronutrient clinic in all hospitals that has a
Yes.
good assay to look at all the micronutrients and the genetics and try and unpick it all. And AI is going to help us unpick this as well.
Yes, and I think you're right. I think we have to take into account the genetics, and of course, in the UK and probably most of Europe, we can afford to do genetic sequencing because we have a universal health system rather than an insurance-based one. So we can afford to find out that someone has a predisposition to something, which you can't on
And then
an
you can target
insurance-based system.
populations on that and
Yes.
look for lower status. So what I was
D-
showing there, your receptor and your carrier protein for B12, the genetic changes, the polymorphisms will predict outcomes. So let's look at the subset that have one genetic variant and look for B12. They probably need a higher B12 status on a serum B12 to protect them than others.
yes. Yes. Does low B12 cause liver damage?
I think low B12 denudes the liver of B12 because you will then prioritize the bloodstream. And it's why only 15% of people present with anemia and macrocytosis and 85% neurological because the body will prioritize the blood. And that's true of iron as well. Iron deficiency will hit you in other ways before you become anemic. So I don't think it damages the liver, but it denudes the liver of actively working B12 because there is no store. The liver has a lot of B12 attached to enzymes working. And if you start to remove it to prioritize the blood, then the liver will struggle. And there are also some studies looking at fatty liver as well, where this might have a relevance. Yeah.
I had not realized that the B12 in the liver is there because it's working,
Yeah,
not
no,
because it's being stored.
in
Yeah.
iron that there are proteins that store iron, but there is no protein that stores B12. It's all being used, or we let it go out.
So Julia asks, what's your response to doctors who say too much B12 is bad or high B12 is related to cancer?
The message there, and Bruce Wolf and Butler, who wrote the paper with us on the BMJ, is yes, a high serum B12 is linked with cancer, but it's the cancer that causes release of B12 from the dying cells that puts your serum B12 up. It's not the high B12 that causes the cancer. So there's an association, but it's not causal.
Yes, or it might be causal, but the other way around.
Yeah, it's a trigger to look, perhaps sometimes, to be sure.
Yes, and we picked that up even in our theoretical situation where we weren't allowed to do proper research. Um, Louise asked if the worry with plant-based diets to save the planet are more concerned with folate for neonatal health and therefore could lead to an increase in cognitive design for future generations. I like that. So vegetarians have cognitive decline.
Uh,
That's me.
so the other thing that Chittaranjan Yajnik found in Pune was that the children of the mothers with B12 supplements in a vegetarian environment were less developed at the age of 4, brain and stature. So this really matters. So this is nature's experiment of a high folate, low B12 diet, which I was talking about what happens to rats, but that there is some human evidence that this is not a good place to be either.
Yes.
But that said, there are ways of being safe as a vegetarian or a vegan. You just need to check your B12 status. You need to take a small supplement, not a milligram, because I'm worried what that does to your microbiome. And it does change your microbiome over fertilizing it with B12. But whether it creates analogs, it does. But do they cause problem? We don't know. But it would be easier just to take 2 micrograms of B12, have it absorbed with a good, because vegetarians aren't pernicious anemics. They should absorb their 2 micrograms. And there are papers in Germany that show if you do that, you can maintain your B12 status and be healthy. But the problem is we bring in veganuary with no mention of B12, and people do it for a month, which isn't a problem with B12 deficiency. But then they stay on it, and the message is missed, and then we get this problem with the B12 deficiency, and not necessarily being able to measure it that well without the other markers because it's not available to primary care. So there's a whole thing to unpick there. So I'm not anti-plant-based diet. You can do it safely. It's good for the planet, but you need to do it safely. And I have a very interesting uh, journal from the original The Vegan magazine from 1967, where all this is discussed with some of the founding fathers of B12 and explaining this is how you would do it safely. And sadly, that message seems to have got lost. But it's back in the Vegan Society website now. And then they have
Mm.
a supplement called Veg One, which has an appropriate amount of B12 and the other 5 micronutrients which are in short supply in a vegan diet. So you can do it safely, but the problem is we don't coach people and we let young children do it, and that's a real concern for me.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Um, Sheila speaks again, saying, my life transformed with B12 injections. I had horrible symptoms from was falling over, dizziness, tinnitus, numbness, hip and groin pain. That thought I was developing MS. So grateful for in our case, the B12 symptom injector.
Mm.
Um, Sue asks, what might you call a high B12 level? Are we saying we don't have a measure for this anymore because we don't trust the tests anymore?
Well, the serum B12, when it's very high, they have to dilute the sample and put it back in again to get a measure of it because it'll only measure up to about 1,000. So it's and that there are people with incredibly high B12 levels, but it won't come out on an assay unless you're
Yeah.
looking. So you won't see it. Uh, yeah, so those numbers that are of concern that are linked to the cancer patients, and they are high in other diseases. They're up in the high the low the just below 1,000 kind of thing, or into the thousands, the very high ones. But they're not saying B12 it's causing the problem.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I always claim that the only way B12 is dangerous to you in high levels if it's on a high shelf and falls on your head.
I,
Um,
I think it might be a marker, and it seems to be a marker in this as in neurological progression because I showed you a paper that's just been published from the University of California. So we need to start to understand why your body is increasing its haptocorrin count. What is the mechanism? What's it trying to do? Why is it putting more out there? Which then will carry some B12, and that will enhance your serum B12 level, but not your hollow transcobalamin level. And it's that bit of B12 that's carried on a high haptocorrin we don't understand, but it's associated with a multiple sclerosis relapse. There's something going on.
but Jill's saying her high levels were prior to injections, which I think comes back to an earlier comment you made that there are so many analogs and isomers and everything else which are all picked up by the same test. So it might not have been usable B12. It might have been
The
that you
ser-
simply had a whole lot in there.
yes, so our current B12 assay is quite specific for B12, not the analogs. Some of the older assays weren't so good. The original microbiological assay, or one of them that used bacteria, would count pseudo B12 because the bacteria grew on pseudo B12. And so it's not so much that, but it's the question of why have you got an enhanced level of a protein that we believe is designed to remove analogs through the bile and out of the body? What's your body trying to achieve? Why is it elevated? Because some of it will then bind the B12 that you're taking and enhance your overall serum B12. And that's what's happening in those cases. But we don't
Yes,
necessarily know why that is. And that, as your cancer cells break down and release haptocorrin, your serum B12 goes up as well.
yes. So the doctors were right to say we better check for cancer. But as she says, she didn't actually have cancer. So the simple answer is we don't yet know. There's work underway.
And we've had another conversation that will be presented at Club 12, but there's another group of researchers in another area of poor nutrition in their kids working in one of the London teaching hospitals have come to us and say, we found this finding of high B12s in this group of patients. Can we come and talk to you to try and understand why that might be the case? So we are finding subsets in various medical domains, subspecialties that have this finding that we don't understand.
Yeah, yep. Um, Louise is asking again about folate. Should levels be towards the higher end of the reference interval or mid-level? I suppose the answer is we don't know.
We don't know, but I like this idea of a Goldilocks zone, and I do think you can have too much and too little.
Yes, yes, certainly of everything else, possibly not B12, but certainly of everything else. There are higher limits. I found a report published by the European Union, funded by the major pharmaceutical companies, telling you how dangerous vitamin supplements were. And it said there is no upper limit to B12. It just said every other one was dangerous. Um, so are there known associations of B12 or B12 deficiency with hyperinsulinemia, hyperinsulinemia and thiamine deficiency?
Pass.
I'm sticking with that answer as well. Absolutely. That's the end of the questions that are already on the chat. I'm sure people will come up with a whole lot more, but we are getting very close to the end point. Thank you very much. It's the end of a long day for you. Thank you very much for staying on and meeting all these people. I hope some of the questions have been useful to you, and I'm sure that the had a lot of thank yous from the on the chat saying thank you very much for a really interesting lecture. You always do really interesting lectures. We put in a rule to say we'd see you every 2 years rather than more often. But I really like having people from Club B12 because there's so much going on and so many different specialisms
Well,
in
thank
Club
you
B12.
to the B12 Deficiency Support Group because they were one of the first areas where I got information, and Joe Chandy's book, etc., was really important to me in the early days to understand things. So it's a two-way thing. It always is. There's a community there as a problem to solve, and it needs more than one person to solve it. So thank you.
Yes. And the reason we stick to having more than one B12 charity is that we have different focus. We work together, but we have slightly different focus, which helps a lot for getting things done. If you don't have a focus, you tend not to get anything done. You do a lot more talking than doing. Um, Club B12 somehow manages to get a lot of brilliant people together to talk about a whole lot of things because, again, individuals have their specialist areas. And I think you're getting not quite subgroups, but certainly groups of people who
We're trying
tend
to
to
work
want.
out how, what I don't want to do is overexpand and then collapse.
Yes,
It's kind of a nice balance at the moment. And our face-to-face meeting in Cambridge next a week on Thursday, Friday, we're full, but we only set the numbers to 50. But that felt appropriate. Yes, that we're just having a conversation, but when you want to have subgroups conversing, we've all got to learn a new software package. And
yep,
I haven't got the energy to learn another software package because we work well with WhatsApp and email, and so I
yes,
don't I don't think we've solved that problem yet. Um,
yes,
but it would be nice at some point to have those groups working on areas of the B12 associations.
yes. We have got ourselves a company version or a charity version of WhatsApp, which would allow us to set up subgroups,
Mhm.
but I haven't got my head around how to.
Yeah, so it needs a
Um,
young
yeah,
mind that just gets it.
yeah.
That
I've got as far as setting up a trustee group and a general group, but
Yeah, and I think that might be the way because we all understand WhatsApp. So
yeah,
it's something we've been debating for a long time. Yeah.
yeah. Thank you very much, Julian. Thank you again. I enjoy coming to the Club B12 as well. They're always fantastic. I haven't managed to make it to a symposium. It's just one more thing. But I think if you've only got 50 places, then you really want to save them for people who do know what they're talking about, rather than me, who's a bit out of date now.
But it's different because it's not high science. It's science and the link with the patients, which the other meetings once a year in America, once every 2 years in America, once every 2 years in Europe, doesn't address that. And that's why all the scientists and doctors love what Club 12 is doing because it's putting it into perspective. Uh, and so it is different. And so people like yourself are really welcome and important in that environment. Here you go.
Thank you very much. Thank you.